Good evening, guten Abend, bonsoir à tous et à tous und herzlich willkommen in der kanadischen Botschaft. And it's great to see so many of you coming here tonight at our embassy to hear one of Canada's most powerful voice on climate change and a call for climate action. So thank you, John, for being with us tonight all the way from Vancouver. And so thank you for traveling all this way to Germany. And so John Vaillant has authored numerous award-winning books on the natural world, such as his bestsellers, The Golden Spruce and the Tiger. But in his latest title, Fire Weather, he tackles the biggest crisis of our time heads-on. And so we can see everywhere the destructive effects on climate change. Just before coming down to this event, I received a news, for example, that President Biden was supposed to come to Germany in 2 days, has postponed his visit because of Hurricane Milton. So, you know, it's everywhere. The hurricanes, wildfires, flood, and droughts, and it, and there's also the Berlin Climate Security Conference in town at the moment. So wildfires have raged across Canada in recent summers, a story that the German media covered extensively. And Fire Weather, which I'm reading right now, I find it's extremely interesting. I'm learning a lot, even as a Canadian who, have studied my country. I'm learning every time I'm reading the book. And it tells the story of one community in particular, the town of Fort McMurray in northern Alberta, that has been affected by wildfire. And by telling this dramatic tale so empathetically and so effectively, John has brought a wider attention to our changing relationship with fire and the role humans have played in triggering and accelerating climate change. So as a result, John was nominated to this year's Pulitzer Prize, and The Independent recently named him one of the world's 100 foremost environmentalists. And John is one of several Canadians who have played important roles in the development and promotion of climate change science. For example, as John explains in Fire Weather, Canadian-born Guy Callender was the first to actually track and graph global warming. After analyzing 100 years of temperature records from weather stations around the world, he detected a trend and published his results in 1938. And in his lifetime, the link between carbon dioxide and temperature would come to be known as the Callender effect. And 86 years later, leaders and experts are meeting today here in Berlin to discuss the challenges and solutions to our warming planet at the Berlin Climate Security Conference. So like Germany and an increasing number of countries around the world, Canada takes its climate commitments seriously. And in keeping with the Paris Agreement, we aim to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And to set us on the right path, our government has developed a range of policies, including the reduction of emissions in the oil and gas sector. Measures range from carbon pricing to clean fuels, methane regulations, and oil and gas cap, which is currently under development. And decarbonizing our economy will be a crucial undertaking in Canada and around the globe. So, to tackle this challenge together, we're working closely with Germany through our energy partnership, and we're working on supplying clean hydrogen to Germany from the east coast of Canada, as well as wind and solar energy, decarbonization technology exchange, and carbon capture and storage. But let's hear from the experts. So I'm delighted to introduce two climate and energy experts who will lead the discussion after John's presentation. So please join me in welcoming Mary Helmish and Loyal Campbell. So is an international climate policy consultant at Adelphi, where she leads the Transatlantic Clean Economy Bridge, an initiative supported by the German Federal Foreign Office to promote climate policy cooperation between Germany, Canada, and the United States. And Loyal Campbell is a research fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations Center for Climate and Foreign Policy, where he works on international climate and energy policy. So he's also has first-hand insights from his previous work in the Canadian oil industry. So thank you for joining us and facilitating this discussion tonight. So now let's get started. So John, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Really proud to be with you tonight and to be here on, I guess, what is technically Canadian soil. Are we? It's amazing to be back in Berlin because the last time I was here was in 1990 for the reunification. This neighborhood looked very, very different then, I can tell you. And I walked through the Brandenburg Gate again, and the last time I was carried through, my feet barely on the ground, by this sea of people that was just as far as you could see. And this whole area here was empty, and there were random homemade sculptures and all kinds of installations, and it was really intense and transitional time. We're going to see how this works. Okay. There we go. And I'd also especially want to thank Gudrun Wills, who is an old friend from Vancouver and who organized all of this. And getting me here lined up with everybody wasn't easy. This book came out in May of 2023, and I've been sort of on perpetual tour since then. You know, I was in Lucca yesterday, and I'm going to be in Connecticut tomorrow, and then Dallas, and etc. I'm just going to dive in. I spent 7 years researching fire weather because it's clear to me that climate disruption, of which fire is just one manifestation, is the issue of our time. It's an atmospheric issue, it's an environmental issue, it's a political issue, it's an energy issue, it's an infrastructure issue, it's a social justice issue. And climate disruption will impact every aspect of our lives for the rest of our lives. If there was ever any doubt that this was so, last summer settled it. We all saw the smoke, even in Europe, and too many of us have seen the fire. Things feel different now. Weather is different now. And fire is different now. The Earth's expressions are intensifying and accelerating. A century ago, the American writer Ernest Hemingway published The Sun Also Rises. And there are a couple of lines in it that have been on my mind lately. How did you go bankrupt? Bill asked. 2 ways, Mike said. Gradually and then suddenly. And I think this applies equally well to the last 50 years of observed and tracked climatic changes. In July of 2023, Thomas Smith, an environmental geographer at the London School of Economics, made a sober observation to the BBC. I'm not aware of a similar period when all parts of the climate system were in record-breaking or abnormal territory. 2023 appears to have been a turning point. What's happening now is non-linear acceleration. Look at any metric of climate distress. So these are North Atlantic sea surface temperatures. That colorful spaghetti are past temperatures over the past 40 years. That red one that's all by itself is 2023. This map is slightly out of date, forgive me. But sneaking in from the left side is 2024, which is going to surpass 2023, I believe. These are global air temperatures for this time of year, going back to the 1980s. And again, we see this kind of steady, lurching trend toward warming, and then this crazy spike in 2023. And 2024, again, is going to be warmer still. So climate scientists, as I understand it, are having a difficult time understanding this. Again, these are the sea temperatures off the north end of Svalbard in the Arctic, off the north coast of Norway. That dotted line you see are kind of average temperatures over the past 20 years. And again, this is 2024, just in a class by itself. So some early map makers described unknown parts of the globe as terra incognita. And our planet and our civilization are now entering what I'm calling clima incognita, the unknown climate. In so doing, we're departing the Holocene epoch, the Goldilocks zone of relative climate stability that enabled us to build the world as we know it over the past 12,000 years. So to borrow from another children's story, The Three Little Pigs, we've built our homes and infrastructure out of straw, and now there's a wolf at the door, and that wolf is climate change in the form of extreme weather in all its forms. We need to recognize this moment for what it is, the beginning of a new era of civilizational retreat, contraction, and consolidation. Call it the post-Holocene. I think it's fair to say we are now in the era of post-Holocene instability. The U.S. has barely begun to recover from Hurricane Helene, one of the most lethal and costly storms in the country's history. When, right now, as we just heard, another monster storm, Hurricane Milton, is headed directly for West Florida. Milton is also historic, having undergone the most rapid intensification from Category 1 to Category 5 of any tracked storm in Atlantic history. It made this leap in intensity in 12 hours. Unprecedented. Meanwhile, out west, the U.S. is currently on National Preparation Level 5 for wildfire. That's the highest level of alert. This is happening simultaneously in the United States. So not surprisingly, the American insurance industry is entering a period of crisis in which wide swaths of the United States, the Gulf Coast, and the West are fast becoming uninsurable. Canada's likely to follow. Capitalism, already a dubious proposition, has a hard time functioning without protections of this kind. And so does our society. The American writer William Gibson described this moment perfectly when he said, "The future is here. It's just not evenly distributed." And so there's a term I want to introduce to you, discontinuity. It was coined by a really remarkable futurist who I urge you all to acquaint yourselves with, working in Berkeley, California, Alex Steffen. He describes discontinuity as an event or situation wherein past experience ceases to be a useful guide to future problem solving. Firefighters have been experiencing discontinuity more and more often over the past decade or two, and 2023 was relentless. How are you supposed to respond to this? So fire radiative power is the raw energy coming off the leading edge of a wildfire. Neil LaRoe, a professor out of the University of Nevada, tracked the energy being emitted by the 2023 fire season in Canada with the use of satellites. And what we see in the lower right-hand corner there are previous fire seasons. And the fire radiative power is measured normally in megawatts, which is 1 million watts. In the case of Canadian fires, it's measured in terawatts, which is 1 trillion watts. The fire season, as you can see, of 2023 was in a class by itself. It generated an estimated 42 terawatts of energy. That's the kind of energy that you can power Beijing with, that you can power Tokyo with for many, many months. Another way to express it is in terms of the area burned. Again, we see previous seasons in the lower right-hand corner. we've had some really bad fire seasons in the past decade, but nothing like 2023. It was more like Australia's Black Summer of 2019, 2020. And here, an area basically the size of Uruguay or Florida or Oklahoma was burned. So another way to think about this is the human impact. And during the fire season of 2023, Canada, a relatively small country, about 40 million, 43 or 44 million, had 250,000 of its citizens wandering the roads, uncertain where they were to go because they had been evacuated due to wildfire. So some of these evacuations were from Yellowknife, and it's a 1,500-kilometer drive to the nearest city with major services like airports and proper hospitals. So being on the road can be even more dangerous than the evacuation. Conrad Sauvé, the CEO of Red Cross Canada, told me that when he started working for Red Cross Canada about 15 years ago, 80% of their work was done outside Canada, which is where you would expect a wealthy, together country to be deploying its Red Cross services. Now, 80% of Canada Red Cross's work is inside Canada. And that, to me, is kind of one of the more disturbing stats that I'm aware of. So this is an extraordinary moment we find ourselves in. Never before have technology, culture, and nature been moving so quickly simultaneously. We're crossing a lot of invisible thresholds that will become visible only through their impacts on things we care about. One reason we find this hard to grasp, I think, is because we are used to being the stars of the show. Historically, it's been humans who have outpaced the natural world. From arrowheads to AI, our species has progressed steadily faster than geologic time, leaving indelible marks as we go. But now, geologic time, climate time, atmospheric time is moving as fast, in some cases faster than we are, faster than technology, faster than history. The world we thought we knew is changing under our feet because we changed it. And I think these twin hurricanes that are battering Florida are a perfect example of that. We cannot keep up with it. And there was a third hurricane, Hurricane John, that hit Acapulco, the west coast of Mexico, and destroyed that city for the second time in 11 months. And we don't even hear about that. But that happened simultaneous with Helene. It was like, a pincher movement on the continent. So I came to understand the implications of this acceleration when Fort McMurray caught on fire back in 2016. Fort McMurray, Alberta, it turns out, is a good place to learn about fire and petroleum and how they fuel the volatile and all-consuming appetites of petrocapitalism. There are a couple of pieces to this, and I'm going to go through them in the order that I first explored them. I'll start with fire. If you live in Canada or Germany, here's a term you need to know. The WUI, as it's called in the States, the wildland-urban interface, is the place where the built environment, where we live right now, butts up against the wild land. And of course, in Canada, that's a lot of forest, but grasslands count too. And this is where a lot of big fires are coming into communities, whether you're in Portugal or Chile or Spain or Canada. And I realize in Germany, this feels like a remote possibility for you, but if you just track how climate change is moving, Germany will have its turn. This is an image I wanted you all to see. You may not have seen this up close, but this is what a wildfire typically looks like. It's usually on the other side of a mountain, on the other side of a ridge. It's not something you really need to worry about too much. You want to keep an eye on it, but you can also tell by the relatively pale smoke that it's not terribly intense. And this is what people in Fort McMurray were looking at on May 2nd, 2016. A very different animal. So Fort McMurray, for those who don't know, is 1,000 kilometers north of the US border, deep in the boreal forest of northern Canada. It is a flammable system, naturally, It burns spectacularly, just under even the most normal historic conditions. And but this fire was different in ways that we'll discover soon. And there are about 100,000 people living and working in Fort McMurray. Again, it's a very remote area. It's an isolated city. The nearest other city, large city, Edmonton, is 5 hours away. So when they get in trouble, they're kind of on their own. But they're also, because of the bitumen industry, so industrialized and so wealthy that I think they also feel pretty invincible, like they can handle whatever's happening. So I'm going to read a short passage from Fire Weather, and this will give you an idea of what they went through and what a lot of people are going through around the world right now. In Fort McMurray, May 3rd began differently for everyone, but it ended the same. For Chandra Linder, it began with a rite of spring. Linder was a labor relations advisor who worked for Syncrude. And Syncrude is one of the big synthetic oil companies up there. I call it synthetic oil because they are not drilling oil up there. They are mining bitumen, which is a tar-like substance that is soaked in sand, and it takes a lot of natural gas to render that into something that an American oil company will want to buy. Very energy-intensive way to get energy. Corey, an engineer, her husband, was employed there too, and so were many of their friends. Blonde, with a pixie cut, Chandra Linder is fit and warm and does not suffer fools. It makes sense once you get to know her, but to an outsider, it might be surprising to see someone so polished and female in such a remote, industry-oriented, testosterone-heavy place. And so to get an idea of the gender imbalance up there at the work sites, which may have 5,000 or 10,000 employees, the ratio is about 25 to 1, men to women. So it's a very weird experience being a woman up there. So for work, Linder dresses accordingly. Minimal makeup, high collars, dark pants, no heels. Clothes suitable for climbing in and out of trucks and SUVs, for working in a world of working men. Linder had already seen the smoke plume southwest of town because everyone had seen it. A windswept cauliflower of billowing grays and browns that appeared to have sprouted full-blown from the forest on Sunday afternoon. It had been growing since then, but it was still many kilometers away, and it wasn't the only one. Over the weekend, the Linders had hosted friends evacuated due to another fire. It was almost a lark. They took photos of the big plume developing across the river the same way one would a sunset or a rainbow. Their friends went home the next day because forestry was on it. Boots were on the ground. Water bombers were in the air. As far as the Linders were concerned, whatever was out there was being handled because that's what people do in Fort McMurray. They handle things. Certainly, the beginning of May was a little early for fires. There were still car-sized blocks of winter ice on the riverbanks, and some local lakes had yet to thaw. But otherwise, this was nothing new. Fires cloud the horizon every spring and summer up here. As Chandra and Corey Linder said, practically in unison, it happens every year. Given the unseasonable heat, it was 33 degrees Celsius that day, breaking the standard record by 6 degrees. And the fact that 5 separate wildfires had ignited around the city that weekend, it's hard to overstate how unconcerned was Fort McMurray's citizenry. But if you were up at dawn on May 3rd, as Chandra Linder was, and you'd seen the sky so full of summer promise as she had, you might understand why. The brilliance of that morning was so exceptional that after her morning shower, Linder did something she hadn't done in a long time. She pulled out her favorite navy blue suit with the skirt, picked some medium heels to go with it, and left her socks in the drawer. And thus attired, she headed off to work in Syncrude's head office. In her garage, there were a few vehicles to choose from, and in keeping with her outfit and her mood, Linder picked the car she calls the little one, a black Porsche that hadn't seen daylight in 6 months. So there was a census done, a national census done in Canada in 2016, and one of the things they discovered is that the median household income in Fort McMurray, despite a downturn in oil prices in 2014, the median household income was still $200,000 a year, making it one of the richest municipalities on the continent. So, winters are long and dark in Fort McMurray, but this one was over. Spring was here, and Linder felt as beautiful and hopeful as the day. So we're still on May 3rd, 2016. We're going to jump ahead about 3.5 or 4 hours. Still feeling the symptoms of spring fever, Chandra Linder knocked off work at lunch and organized herself for a 2 o'clock meeting at Syncrude's downtown office in the Borealis building. With no traffic, it's a 30-minute drive down the highway. Still 20 kilometers north of downtown, she was rounding a long, gradual bend in the river when her windshield filled with something she did not recognize. When I got that first view of it, said Linder, I went, hang on a second. It was clear overhead, but to the south, it was black. Black smoke with streaks of red in it. It took up the whole sky. I'm trying to make sense of this thing. I'm thinking, well, maybe it just looks closer than it is. I'm thinking maybe the red is the sun shining through the smoke. But it's not the sun. It's in the wrong place. And then I realize it's flame. Linder had seen a lot of fire plumes, but this didn't look like any of them. So I pull over to the side of the highway and I call my guy Byron and I say, are we having this meeting? And he's like, no, we are not having this meeting. Don't come in. And I'm like, I'm looking at a wall of flames here. It was a short call, in part because no one was quite sure what to say next. What do you say on a beautiful spring day when the city where you live and conduct business appears to be on fire? After hanging up, Linder continued on to her exit, where she turned west, back up the hill and out of the river valley. Okay, she said, not right, but here's what I do. I'm going to go home anyway. I drive past the dry cleaners. Well, I'm going to drop off my stuff at Sam's place, because in my mind, the fire's still on the other side of the river, downtown. So I'm dropping my stuff off, and this guy comes in from the golf course in full golf apparel, and he's like, holy shit, we just got evacuated from the golf course. And I'm like, well, what are you doing here? And he says, well, I'm here to pick up my dry cleaning. And I said, what golf course were you on? Because we have 2 in town. And he says, Thickwood, meaning the fire has just jumped the river. The Athabasca River by the Thickwood Golf Course is 1/2 kilometer wide. So, continued Linder, Sam the dry cleaner, who's our buddy, is on the phone to his wife. Honey, it just jumped the river. Get out, get out, get out. In all this craziness, Sam still takes my dry cleaning, logs it, and he's like, Tuesday good? And I'm like, yeah, next Tuesday's great. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, on May 3rd, Linder tucked her laundry ticket safely in her wallet and aimed the Porsche for home. So that was at 2 o'clock, and that's 2:45. Gradually, and then suddenly. The guy who took this photo was Paul Ayerst. You can see the dashboard, the hood of his truck reflecting. These are fireballs. He's the rolling across the road. He's the last person out of his neighborhood. And what he's seeing in front of him is these fireballs rolling over his wife and daughter's cars. And there is nothing he can do. And this is an attribute of what I term 21st century fire. It moves a lot faster, it burns a lot more intensely. And that's because, again, I talked about these invisible thresholds, and one of them is temperature. So on that day, it was 33 Celsius in the Canadian subarctic. But the more ominous stat was the relative humidity. And I did some looking at the weather stations, and the relative humidity that day was 12%. So that didn't mean a lot to me until I started looking around to see where 12% humidity was a normal percentage. And where it's normal is Death Valley in Southern California in the month of July. So now you have desert dryness, desert temperature in a very naturally flammable ecosystem. And that combination is going to be spectacular in all the wrong ways. So you had 100-meter flames across a 10-kilometer wide fire front rolling into this city. Unstoppable. There is no equipment that humans have that can stop that. The radiant heat coming off of that fire, radiant heat is the heat that tells you not to touch the candle. It's invisible, of course. It moves at the speed of light. The radiant heat was 500 Celsius, hotter than the planet Venus. And what that does is it dries out everything in front of it for many hundreds of meters. Every tree, every lawn, every flower garden, every house suddenly becomes bone dry, but also combustion hot without being on fire. And so the reason fire is hot is to release the hydrocarbons that make the thing burn. So if you put a log on the fire, it won't burn, but it needs to be heated up until the log or my running shoe or this chair starts to off-gas hydrocarbons. That's what the heat does. So the radiant heat is basically preparing the entire city of Fort McMurray by cranking it up to hundreds of Celsius, so every house, every flower garden, every truck tire, every swing set is off-gassing hydrocarbons. And so what we see is a fire over there and a neighborhood over there. What the fire sees is this huge cloud of flammable gas just waiting. And that's what the embers do. So the embers are flying over. The fire looks like it's safely over there. The embers, now blowing in the ferocious wind that the heat is generating, are landing, and everywhere they land, they burst into flame. So basically, it's impossible to be in Germany and not think about this, to not think about Hamburg and Dresden and the bombs that the Allies dropped that were specifically designed to start fires. And that's what these embers did. So in a way, Fort McMurray bombed itself. And when I talked to a physicist about how it was possible for $750,000 houses that were brand new to burn from the roof to the basement in 5 minutes, he said, "You need to study the Hamburg firestorm." That's what he referred me to as my research material. So that's how intense it was. This was a natural fire. It came out of the forest, but we are in a new world now, and it burns differently. So another one of the characteristics of these fires are these giant pyrocumulonimbus fire systems that rise up over them. And they are huge weather systems made of fire, made by the fire, that turn like hurricanes. And they rise up 14, 15 kilometers into the air, puncture the stratosphere. They generate their own lightning. They generate their own hail. They can perpetuate themselves. They're extraordinarily powerful systems that also create a huge amount of wind that again, just pulling in oxygen from everywhere to keep this fire roaring. So I wanted to show you a couple of photos from inside the fire. This is a photo that only a photographer could have taken, a firefighter could have taken. Another one of the quality of 21st century fire is it doesn't stop. So this is not May 3rd. This is not May 4th. This is May 5th. It's still in the city. It's still burning day and night. This photo, it was as dark as night in the daytime because of the smoke, but this was taken at 3 in the morning. And they are fighting the fire just as hard. And the thing about that, the fire doesn't get tired. But the firefighters do. These guys have been up for 24, 48, 56 hours. They are just literally hallucinating on their feet, operating heavy equipment, trying to save their town. So it's very intense. And what you see up there, where the hose turns gray, we know how powerful, thank you, a fire hose is. Turned on you, it would clear the room, push you all into the back corner. Here, the fire is so intense in the heart of that neighborhood that it's bending the stream, vaporizing it, and sending it up into the column. And the next time you're going to see that water is after it's got up to around 30,000 feet. It's going to freeze around little bits of burnt house and tree, and it's going to come back to earth as black hail. And the only place besides Fort McMurray where I heard about black hail is in Exodus in the Bible. It's really different energy. So they gave up with the water because the water didn't work, and so they just started tearing the houses down. They plowed a fire break through the city. These houses were a year old, $600,000 a pop. These heavy equipment operators whom I interviewed, they knew people living in these houses, and they're tearing their houses apart and like, oh, there goes the crib, oh, there goes a fridge full of beer, and they leveled everything, and they actually managed to stop the fire in that neighborhood, but not in the city. This is a photo taken on the night of May 3rd, about 30 kilometers north by an evacuee. A lot of people just ran out of gas as they left town, but that throbbing dome is Fort McMurray burning. Probably what Dresden looked like, and it's probably what Hamburg looked like. And no one's ready for it. It happens. So this is a scene that, at least in North America, we've gotten way too familiar with. But back in 2016, it was still quite a shocking image. This is, I think it's the Prospect neighborhood where they were doing the leveling with the bulldozers. This is the part that burned. And we've all seen a house fire. Lots of the house survives. It's the water that does a lot of the damage. Here, it was total destruction. And then, the metal is warped and distorted. Softer metals melted. They couldn't find toilets and bathtubs because the porcelain vaporized. I mean, it's a different order of intensity. And what struck me is how much this looks like this. So this is a tar sands mine. This is where they mine bitumen. This, in fact, is Syncrude, where Chandra Linder and her husband used to work. They don't live in Fort McMurray anymore. A lot of people who went through that fire do not live there anymore. It was the biggest, most rapid evacuation due to fire, by the way, in modern times. So 88,000 people were cleared out of that city in an afternoon. And so in that sense, the speed of the evacuation was very similar to the evacuation of Chernobyl after that meltdown. So this is kind of a shocking sight, and it's hard to wrap your head around because it's so huge, but this was all boreal forest. It's all been scraped off by bulldozers that are almost as wide as this room. And underneath is the bitumen-soaked sand that they mine. And so in the back there's an upgrader that basically separates by the bitumen, this very tar-like kind of driveway sealer substance, from the sand, and turns it into a liquid that can then be shipped south for refinement, further refinement. But those yellow, pale, kind of rhomboid shapes you see are sulfur piles, and they are by volume bigger than the pyramids at Giza. In the foreground, these little things that look like sheds, those little box-like things, those are T-797 hauler trucks. Each one of them weighs 400 tons empty. Its tires are about 4 meters tall. They cost about $85,000 a piece. There's hundreds of these machines driving around north of Fort McMurray, and they have cleared off an area beyond repair of about 1,000 square miles. And within this space are these colossal tailings ponds, way bigger than the Tiergarten, full of toxic effluent that nobody knows what to do with. So long before this is just one last image here. These are G7 CO2 reductions since 1990, and everybody seems to be making an effort and bringing their levels down, some more than others. Germany's looking pretty good there. There's Canada, though, bringing up the rear and actually increasing. So that's problematic. Long before we split the atom, We were tampering with the wizard's book of spells. We wanted fire's fierce energy in a bottle, a barrel, a pipeline, and we got it. Energy to burn, energy to power the world, and energy to generate wealth beyond our wildest dreams. So, but as big oil supercharges our economy and its own bottom line with record profits, it's also supercharging our atmosphere with record quantities of greenhouse gases. CO2 levels are now fully 50% higher than they were in pre-industrial times. I assume most of you are familiar with the Keeling curve of CO2. Charles Keeling out of Caltech developed a machine that could measure CO2 in parts per million. And he figured that out in the mid-1950s. And so he found a baseline for that period and then noticed quickly that it was rising steadily. And we're at about 424, 427 parts per million right now. And once you get up there, it isn't like stopping driving cars and clearing the air overhead. It stays there for a very long time, effectively for the foreseeable future. So one way to understand the prevailing economic system is as a Ponzi scheme powered by fossil fuels and leveraged against the future of almost all living things. So looked at in this way, the most accurate way to calculate the debt on our current system of fire-powered civilization is by measuring CO2. So it's probably the truest and simplest measure of the debt incurred by our devotion to and dependence on fossil fuels, which drive about 80% of our economy worldwide. And so if we understand CO2 as debt, then heat is the interest on that debt. So this is a chart going back to 1850. We were in quite a cool period for most of the 19th century. And then it kind of went up and down, which normally happens. We have natural fluctuation in our climate. That's just part of the package of living on Earth. And then you see, the past 30 years or so, a very distinct change happens. And again, note 2023. Look at that jump in the extreme right. So starting around 2000, global temperatures began rising steadily and noticeably. And what this tells us is that our CO2 debt level has become unsustainable, and the interest unpayable, to the point that we now find ourselves in a default zone. And typically, when we default on a loan, the bank calls in the debt. In fact, they might even start repossessing your stuff. And so this is one way to understand the steady increase in fossil fuel-enhanced disasters. These floods, fires, heat waves, and intensifying storms are the bank of nature's repo men coming to collect on that debt, repossessing our homes, our cars, our towns, even our very lives. A more positive and forward-looking way to interpret this moment is as a stern invitation to mature out of petroleum-powered capitalism's dangerous delusion that A, nature is some kind of bottomless trust fund that we can draw on at will, and B, that we are somehow in charge. I don't care what your business is or what country you're from, nature owns 51% of it. Until we recognize that the natural world has a controlling interest in everything we do, she will continue to remind us in progressively more violent ways, and she will continue collecting on that debt. So, to be clear, coal is an 18th century fuel. Oil, which still drives about 80% of the world's economic activity, is a 19th century fuel. The internal combustion engine was prototyped in 1860. Standard Oil, now Exxon, Esso, was founded in 1870. Bitumen, what they're mining up in Fort McMurray, is not a fuel at all. As I said, it's a driveway sealer. In ancient times, it was used as mortar to stick bricks together. In Alberta, the Dene people used it to seal their canoes. It takes billions of cubic feet of natural gas every day to melt and fractionate bitumen into substances that American petroleum refiners will want to buy at a steep discount. So why on earth are we still doing this? Especially when we are literally surrounded by infinite quantities of renewable energy, especially when scientists have understood the basics of the greenhouse effect literally since the 18th century, especially since we've understood the heat-retaining qualities of CO2 since the 1850s. Scientists were speculating on industrial CO2's potential for altering the climate as early as the 1890s. The only reason we labor so hard to liberate coal, oil, and gas from the ground is so we can burn it. In other words, if you're in the petroleum industry, you're in the fire industry, which means you're in the CO2 industry, which means you're in the climate changing industry. Now, we all grew up in the petroleum age. It's ambient for us. It feels normal to us. It smells normal to us. It really makes the world work in some amazing, wonderful ways. It's why I'm here. It's why we're here together. So we should be grateful for that. But at the same time, it also took me 7 years of thinking about this to fully understand what the petroleum industry is. And that's what's being served, is fire energy. And it is now reflecting back in some very devastating ways. What's alarming, and frankly probably indictable, is the fact that petroleum companies have known this for 50 years. In fact, they've been leaders in climate science. Some of you may have seen this memo from 1982 based on basically 1970s science. This was an internal memo distributed among the upper levels of the Exxon leadership. This is basically gaming out climate change or stability from 1850 to 2150. That horizontal line, the fat arrow that goes straight across, was these scientists' prediction of what would happen if we didn't expand fossil fuel use, if we just kind of left it at 1970s levels. That second arrow that goes lurching off into the upper corner is what they predicted would happen if we continued to develop our fossil fuel resources as aggressively as they were being developed in the 1970s. And Exxon was the biggest, most powerful company in the world in the 1980s, and of course they could hire the best scientists. And their scientists did excellent work, and they nailed it. That's where we are, and they knew. And it's shocking to consider what they knew and when they knew it. So this presents a quandary for the business. How do you separate oil from fire or burning from emissions? You can't. And so starting in the 1980s, the industry, along with its allies in government, in churches, in finance, in the media, embarked on a disinformation campaign to disavow and undermine their own science. And they've been doing it ever since. When they were called out on this, they tried greenwashing, but they were called out on that too. And now, in 2024, we find ourselves in an untenable contradiction. Suncor is one of the big tar sands producers, oil sands producers up in Fort McMurray. This was on their website when I looked last. Our purpose is to provide trusted energy that enhances people's lives while caring for each other and the earth. I would want to work for that company. I would want to do business with that company. I would want to use that company's energy. At the time, Suncor had a viable renewable energy business. There was even some talk of maybe a bit of transition. But last year, they sold it. And despite record-breaking profits, and they hired a new CEO, a guy out of Exxon named Rich Kruger. And this is what Rich Kruger told the press. So I'm not singling out Suncor here. This is an example of what every petroleum CEO has told the press over the past year. Look what Shell has just told Reuters. There's no longer any attempt to cover their ambitions up. They've basically said the money's too good. Exxon's Darren Woods got a 50% pay raise last year, while the median Exxon employee's wage dropped by 10%. Suncor enjoyed record profits too, and they also fired 1,500 workers and sold off their side business in renewable energy. Houston, which is sort of the Fort McMurray of the United States, has shed 60,000 petroleum jobs over the past decade, and Shell, a big employer there, is about to lay off another 20% of that workforce. Shareholders, it seems, come first, second, and third before workers, before the climate, before common sense, and before common decency. Even the Wall Street Journal, historically friendly to big business and big oil, is calling them out. Exactly a year ago, they published an expose entitled Inside Exxon's Strategy to Downplay Climate Change. There's another way to put that. This is Alex Steffen again. He calls this strategy predatory delay. And that is what is happening in force around in the petroleum world, the deliberate slowing of change to prolong a profitable but unsustainable status quo whose costs will be paid by others, whose costs are being paid by the people getting rolled over by Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton and the Fort McMurray fire. So, I think a fair question is it a crime to sabotage the future? And why would somebody do that? John Kenneth Galbraith, a U.S. economist, ambassador, and author, wrote, "People of privilege will risk their complete destruction rather than surrender any material part of their advantage." Loyalty to the status quo, especially when it's profitable, is compelling and often corrupting. If you haven't seen Jonathan Glazer's film, The Zone of Interest, it's a masterpiece and also instructive. I think it derives from an elemental instinct for self-preservation that some might call selfishness or greed, but I think of Chandra Linder. The city's on fire, but we still want to do our dry cleaning, or build solar panels, or go on vacation, or visit our daughter in Montreal. Just about all of us have plans for our day, for our lives, and they don't include climate change. So I just got the high sign. I could go on and on, as you can probably tell. Thank you very much for bearing with me. We actually have real experts on hand tonight, and I'm really thrilled that they'll be joining. So thank you very much for your kind attention. I appreciate it.
Well, that is a tough act to follow. Powerful, striking, provocative, profound. I think it's clear why this work has yielded so much attention and accolades, so thank you. I grew up 5 hours away from the city that was burning on the big screen, and so it's very real. That summer, my parents couldn't go out in their backyard 5 hours away because it was so black. Yeah, it's real. So anyways, I think that it's time for us to invite our other guests up on the stage. There's lots to talk about, lots to process. And so I invite Loyal and Mary up to share a few words, and then we would like to hear from others who have joined us tonight. Thank you.
Test, is this on? Yes. No. Yes, it is on. Okay. Okay. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining. My name is Mary Helmick. I am the moderator today. I work for a climate and energy think and do tank called Adelphi, based here in Berlin. And while I am not Canadian, I did grow up in Minnesota, so I've always felt a kinship with you all. So thank you for letting me be on stage with you. And I would just like to start with a question. The first thing that came to mind when, not the first thing that came to mind when reading this was, oh my God, horror. And, you know, you think of a huge fire as being horrific, but you describe it in a way that is horror like I wasn't capable of imagining. So yeah, hats off for your writing ability there. But I want to start with a question of, you coined a new term, 21st century fire, and I'd like to, you mentioned this in your presentation, but I'd like to just have you walk us through it. Why did we need this, and why is this different from the, millennia of fires that have come before?
So the short answer to that is, the short answer to that is, would be frequency, the amount of how often they happen, and then the intensity of what happens next. So, one of the signatures, if you will, of these big fires is this pyrocumulonimbus fire system, this stratosphere puncturing weather system that really wasn't even in the literature of fire in the 1990s. It was something that was thought to generally occur over volcanoes exclusively. And then they started seeing them, and satellite imagery got better, and they started seeing them over big fires. Even then, it was a rarity. This fire season of 2023, Canada by itself generated 142 pyro-CBs. That has never happened on planet Earth in human history. It's just an extraordinary amount of energy for a fire. These are not refinery explosions. These are the woods burning, and they burn differently now. So that, and I think there's this thing called the Lucretius problem. I was just in Italy. Lucrezio is the famous Roman philosopher and poet. And he talked about, he said, and it's been translated in sort of a mean way, which is the fool believes the biggest mountain in the world is the biggest mountain he himself has seen. And basically what that says is that we tend to base our notion of what anything is on our own experience of it. And so the people who fought the Fort McMurray fire based their firefighting experience on previous fires. This was not one of those fires. And the same with these hurricanes that are now battering. You get these anomalies like Katrina or Ian, but they're, once every few years. Now, we're having 2 in a month. These are category 5s or 4s and colossal things. And so there's a real cognitive shortcoming in our minds. And so we're having to kind of leap forward. And 21st century fire is an attempt to itemize what the characteristics are and invite people to consider them as this is what you can expect now. It may not happen every time. We may have 1990s fires, but now we've set the bar up. And same with hurricanes. There's actually serious discussion now of creating a category 6. And that's where we're at. And you see, like the Australian Fire Service has added new colors to their fire risk map. And that speaks volumes about how the world is changing.
Yeah, it absolutely does. Category 6, that just gives me chills to think. I'd like to move to, so you've discussed in interviews that this is a national story, but what you strive to do is take the national and make it international and find universal connections. You've just spoken to some other examples, but I would like to hear what were the most surprising places that you went to internationally as you researched this book. You mentioned the Hamburg firestorm, but where are the most unusual places that you didn't think the comparisons to this fire would take you in the world?
Well, I'm speaking at a huge insurance conference in Toronto, and that's just not a room I would ever, frankly, I wouldn't really imagine myself even being in this room, and I'm really glad, again, thank you for having me. I'm really glad to be here with you. And this is hard stuff to talk about, but what I have found, and likewise, I got invited to speak at the World Bank in DC, and again, these are people who, some individual might read my book, but people are not saying come in and talk to a bunch of us. And so I think I tried really hard in this book to create a number of different pathways in. So there's graphs, there's science, there are stats, but there's also human stories and also history. And so there's a bunch of different for basically, we know there are different types of intelligence. We have different experience, different ways of connecting to material, and also this topic is so big, it's so huge that I feel like you almost need to deploy all those techniques just to do the subject justice. It's so massive, it's so ubiquitous. Fire is so much about who we are, and we really probably would be a different species now without it. It's so central to everything, so I think that all an artist can do and all a writer can do is try to rise to the level of the material. And the material's always going to be bigger and grander and more beautiful or terrible than you, but you try to get up there. And it's really, it has been surprising and kind of wonderful to have bankers want to talk to me. That doesn't happen every day. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Those aren't usually the kind of environmentalist fangirls that we think of approaching us. Loyal, I'd like to bring your perspective in. So if we're talking about applying specific national, local cases in Canada to events that are, unfurling around the world, how does this materialize in your work? And tell us a bit about your background in Canada, and then you reading, John's work and thinking, how do we apply this to climate policy and energy policy narratives, which is your bread and butter now?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mary. I very much appreciate the opportunity as well. Thank you, our host, the lovely women organizing the event. It was absolutely great to be part of this, and I really appreciate the presentation, John, and the book as well. Absolutely wonderful. So my background, my name is Loyal Campbell. I'm from near Kelowna, so kind of in the middle of British Columbia. After I graduated high school, I didn't want to go to university right away, so I went into Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, and worked in various parts of the oil and service gas fields. So whether that be on drilling rigs, service rigs, fracking rigs, all throughout kind of central Canada, whether that be in the northern parts of the provinces, or the southern parts of the provinces, or the central parts of the provinces. So I've seen quite a few of these communities. And it's, after I finished work there for 5 or 6 years, I studied politics and energy and climate sciences in Europe. So I've been working with the German Council on Foreign Relations at the Climate Center here on the climate foreign policy strategy and energy politics for the last 2 years, kind of trying to map out how countries can work together to have more effective renewable energy targets, to meet climate obligations, and how to bring countries together and cooperate on this. So I think, as per your question, I think some of the interesting takeaways from the presentation is this delusion of control. And I think that this is really, when you're referencing stuff back to what you've known and what you've done in the past, the delusion of control is kind of dispelled very quickly. And I mean, me as someone who grew up in British Columbia, which is a province that's very frequently on fire, I grew up seeing fires constantly, and even the last 2 or 3 times that I've tried to visit home, which is every 2 years if I can, the flights have been obstructed from even visiting. It's not even called the Okanagan anymore, it's called the Smokanagan. No, but it is a serious point. It's kind of, I remember being there when the clouds were so black during the middle of the summer. This is one of the only desert regions in Canada, by the way. Canada is not known for deserts. My region is the only desert in the entire country. In the summer, it has less rain than Las Vegas, cumulatively, yes? So this is a very dry region. It gets to some 38, 40 degrees in the summer, very hot, tons of sun. But
49 in 2021, 49C in Canada, 49.6.
That's wild. But the interesting caveat is in 2018, I think, there was entire week, there's like 2 or 3 weeks where the fires were so bad, it was pitch black during the day, middle of the day, pitch black. There was scheduled marathon runs through the valley, and they were canceled because the weather was so dangerous for the runners that they thought that some of these people might actually die from running in long distance through the smoke. And how this relates to, I guess, back to your question, before I go to a tangent.
Global level of climate and energy policy, how do you apply?
How do you apply this? I think the interesting thing about this is that this is a really extreme example where you can see a prosperous nation not knowing how to actually handle this. And I think a good example in the German context is the flood that actually recently. So fire is the subject of today, but I think it's interesting to see that the evolution of terms and the evolution of science in terms of even how to articulate this is it's no longer called really 100-year event, climactic events, decade events. Like these things are happening in rapid succession, and sometimes at the same time. You can go from a record flood that wipes out a system to having a fire almost a few weeks later. And it's just not knowing how to respond to this is kind of a really, really, really challenging.
Yeah, Milton is maybe the Tuesday event within the last week instead of a 100-year storm, which it might have been in the past. I'd like to dig deeper into this. You know, you're referring to it as a delusion of control. That also connects, I think, to this kind of willful denialism that you lay out in your book. You gave a fantastic example with the dry cleaning topic. But you make this dissonance between the Fort McMurray residents so relatable and understandable. And you hear a man describing, oh, we can stay, and his wife saying, there are flames on our street, what are you talking about? And you can imagine if I walked in and saw my kitchen on fire, I would be rooted to the spot. And it's human and it's understandable, but reading it, I just felt depressed. If this is how we as humans respond to flames in front of our face, then how do we apply this micro example to the macro, sometimes real, sometimes metaphorical flames engulfing the planet? I mean, how do we unroot ourselves from the spot globally?
A couple of things that I'm sure Loyal would have some things to say about this too, but I do want to make it really clear that Chandra is a good, intelligent person. And she told me very bravely that story more as an example of human nature. And basically what she did there is what all of us are doing, is just change the parameters of her safe space. So before May 3rd, everybody thought the fires stay in the forest and we do our thing in Fort McMurray and we can do whatever we want to the forest up north, however violently. It's all good. We know what we're doing. And when that fire came in, when it crossed the green belt into their space, what she did was this kind of psychological, intellectual jujitsu where she said, okay, well, yeah, the fire's in the city, but it's not in my part of the city. And that is not because she's selfish or callous. It's really a defense mechanism. And I think that's what we do. As Homo sapiens, we're an old, quite simple species in certain respects. And so I really wanted to draw a distinction between that type of self-protection and the malignant denial of oil company executives and the bankers and governments and churches and media who validate them and who continue to sow. I mean, I'm on Twitter all the time, and it's amazing. People with massive followings just outright denying and trying to pollute the discourse around meaningful action. It's malignant to do that, and it's dangerous to do that. And now, there's a body count. So these are criminal acts in my view, but we really need to make a distinction between people who are responding in the moment, like Chandra was, and something that we also, as far as feeling hopeful, so we've seen these horrible fatalities in Lahaina and Valparaiso, Chile recently. I think they've lost maybe over 200 people from Hurricane Helene. In Fort McMurray, the evacuation was called late. Every single person made it out alive. And something else that we need to understand is, well, only people in Sweden could do that, only some homogeneous population could pull that off, And the other thing the census of 2016 revealed about Fort McMurray, besides these extraordinary household incomes, 80 different languages were spoken in that city. And they all got out, different religions, different life experience, different concepts of what risk is and how you might respond. Between the police and the firefighters and the neighbors, not a single person was left in the basement. And so we could say, well, only Canadians could do that. Well, Canadians in 79 other, or 75 other languages that aren't, local to Canada. So that, I think is beautiful and miraculous, and people had difficult choices to make. And how do you get 80,000 people to all make the right choice? That isn't luck. Something else is going on there.
Yeah, it's a remarkable human tale, what you portray in this story. And to apply this, moving it, getting it together in time after being rooted to the spot, in a policy context, I mean, you know, you and I, Loyal, we both work in climate policy, and it feels like we're just screaming into a void almost all of the time. How do you reconcile this with your work? Do you see moments of people rallying together and getting it together in the policy context?
Yeah, thank you again for the question. I think the term predatory delay, that really resonates with me. And I mean, like, you could even extend that to like predatory obfuscation, or because it's so much more than just greenwashing. I mean, greenwashing, you're just kind of sugarcoating or trying to dilute the actions that you're doing, right? And I think that that's an entirely different threshold of negligence and you know, kind of, yeah, you know, dishonest practice versus actively trying to obstruct, actively trying to delay, actively trying to mislead and complicate matters. And I think this is something you see within the global climate apparatus, especially in terms of governance, and almost on a regular basis. I mean, this isn't just one country doing this. There's so many countries, so many actors that are really driving this. And this is one of the things where in our previous conversation bilaterally, I mentioned like the difference between international oil companies and national oil companies. And you know, like Exxons and Chevrons and Shells definitely deserve their day in the sun, for sure. I totally agree with you that, but like when you look at like Aramco's and these big national petroleum companies and how they facilitate the existence of petrostates, right? So really this is an entire national system built off of an oil company. And these end up being very complex systems in their own right. And the relationships between them and how obstructive those companies can be because they have direct control over the government. I mean, it's not, I wouldn't necessarily discount Exxon's influence in DC. I would never discount that because it's in no doubt substantial. But I would say that Aramco or Gazprom or Rosneft probably have more influence in Moscow or in Riyadh than Exxon does in DC. So in this case, I think within the international context, you end up with a very complicated dynamic because the national actors are also acting directly in the interests of their oil companies because the oil companies are a part of the state and that is their breadwinner. And that's something that I think ends up being very much more complicated, especially with the term predatory delay, because these actors have unlimited resources to essentially obstruct the circumstance and they're directly impacted by it. But yeah, I mean, you saw this at COP28 in Dubai. I mean, there was a record amount of gas deals put off on the side. Yeah, they had lots of very interesting takeaways with the triple up, double down targets and some, you know, some minor pittance of $100 million allocated to loss and damages. But when you talk about the actual revenue of any of these companies or countries, it's minuscule.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, people will ask me, and I'm sure you get this question too, you work in climate policy, how are you not just depressed all the time? And the answer is, you know, my colleagues, we get weekly happy hour. We're like, you know, we live life anyway, because that's what you have to do. And I think this is what you portray so stunningly in the book. You have people evacuating, and they are arriving at these shelters, and they are joking about what they just experienced, and they are swapping stories, and what were you doing the moment that you had to leave? And they are, you know, there's this kind of greenery punching through the flames and the horror that insists on being there anyway. And that's kind of an optimistic note where you leave the book. You talk about transitioning from homo flagrans, which we are now, to homo viriditas, which is this greening energy that this is, you know, the default of how the planet wants to work. It wants to aggressively green and have lush growth everywhere. And you see that in people's resilience. But it would be interesting to hear from both of you how can we transition? Is it too late to become homo viriditas, to become greening energy that saves the planet? John, from your perspective, you know, you talk about renegotiating our relationship to nature. How do we do that? How can you do that in Canada? And then I'll hop over to you, Loyal. How can we do that from a policy perspective?
What I didn't have a chance to get into because I went on so long in the early part of my talk was these incredible advances that are happening right now around renewable energy. And if you do want to cheer yourself up, in a reality-based way. I really recommend Akshat Rathi's book, Climate Capitalism. And it almost sounds like an oxymoron, but he helped found the climate desk for Bloomberg. And each chapter is basically a profile of a different person, and so much airtime is taken up with the Musks and the Thiels of the world, but they're actual inventors and businessmen and women who are really moving the needle around renewable energy and batteries. And he profiles these folks. And a lot of them I'd never heard of them. A lot of them are from Asia and the East, and just aren't in our daily news cycle, but they are moving the needle in really powerful ways. And this isn't a hypothetical, wouldn't it be nice if? This is happening now and affecting our lives. So that is a really good thing to read, and just to know that these people are out there. And then another thing that was a really good reset for me, there's a documentary film called The Biggest Little Farm, and it's some folks deploying permaculture on this completely destroyed piece of Southern California, basically desert. And it takes about 10 years, but they turn it into this paradise. And they had to move at Earth time to do it. AI is not going to do it for you. Petroleum-powered machinery is not going to do it for you. They had to basically re-engage with nature at its pace. And that is basically what nature, if we don't do it, nature will do it, in the sense that in North Carolina, far away from the coast, Hurricane Helene broke 100 roads, broke the roads, including 2 interstates. And interstates are the connective tissue of the United States. They are very robust. They're built to military grade. And 2 different interstates were broken in multiple places, forcing people to simplify and localize. And that is the message. That's the message over and over again. And so that is possible to do. I think that I just learned the diesel engine was sort of originally conceived as a way to kind of democratize energy. So you didn't need a huge steam engine. You could have a smaller motor out on your farm and you could do your own thing. Well, solar power and wind power is the same. And so we're in this moment now where renewable energy is being laid on by the gigawatt weekly. China, of course, is leading the charge, but some leadership is also coming from unlikely places like Texas. And Texas, is the Alberta of the United States. It has a climate denial policy officially. It's, cattle, horses, God, and oil, but they are really leaning into renewables. And that is surprising. Alberta is not. Alberta is a petrostate. And it functions as if it is completely captive to the petroleum industry, to the point that they have imposed moratoria on renewable energy. And that's Texas investment getting thwarted. And Texas is one of the best friends Alberta has, and they're alienating Texans. So it's interesting, and some of the most positive scenarios and developments are not always coming from the most likely sources. And that, to me, is encouraging. There's more than one way to approach this, and more than one motive to get people invested.
Yeah, the business case, money is not red or blue, like Democrats or Republicans, it's green, and that's a universal language that everyone can get on board with. The Inflation Reduction Act is a huge piece of evidence for that. Loyal, over to you.
Yeah, no, I really like the juxtaposition between Texas and Alberta, and I think this is on whether or not on how you frame the opportunities of the. And this is more like capturing people's a capitalist or an innovator's imagination of how do you create renewable opportunities? How do you create a green circular solution? Because also, if you think about all of the waste produced, this is outside of emissions, like just in terms of garbage or even like refuse. Like there's all of this material that if you can turn this into a sustainable good, you've got basically unlimited input that's virtually people are trying to get rid of, and it's for free. So there's lots of opportunity for innovation and creativity here, and I think that giving credit, especially to these innovators, is something that does give me a lot of optimism. In general, there was one point that I wanted to respond to. I forget, you mentioned so many good things. It's very hard to respond to all of them. The technological innovation is something that gives me a lot of hope. One thing that I do see sometimes that makes me optimistic about the circumstances is that, I mean, the global nature of climate change, you can see certain countries really being pioneering in the space, and it doesn't necessarily always have. Absolutely, or Costa Rica. Yeah. Costa Rica is another great example. I mean, there's lots of countries that have very strong, decisive action on, whether it be on biodiversity or focusing on like circular foods and alternative protein types and all of this kind of stuff, or sustainable fishery management or sustainable resource management. There's a lot of really interesting innovation, or a lot of interesting innovation in terms of like concrete that you can build in ports and then it turns into coral reefs. Like there's all of these like super interesting innovations, and I think exactly. And this is something that I think that I'm very optimistic about. Again, the problem is back to your point where technology is actually being outpaced by nature, and I think that that's a stark reality that we're kind of dealing with. So that I do think that innovation can and probably will solve the problems. Whether or not it will be fast enough is kind of the sad and kind of grim point of it, because I do think there are technical applications and solutions for lots of these things, and that does give me hope. But I do think that another interesting point is that kind of political thought that's coming out of France is a concept called energy sobriety, and this is something that I think is I think this is an interesting thing to apply more broadly. Is like, when do you actually, how much energy do you actually need for a certain thing? And in the military context, and they use the context or the name operational energy. And the idea is, how much energy do you actually need to reach desired outcomes or the objective of your mission? In this context, it's more about thinking as a consumer, do I actually need this? And it's not to actually try and curtail the great necessities or actualities of modern life, but it's kind of thinking like, do I actually need it? And this is kind of where demand side management as an energy technical term kind of becomes interesting, because do you actually need your fridge to be that cold? Do you actually need your things? And this is where I think having kind of social conversations in different countries, you can draw a lot of inspiration from what conversations are happening over here, over there, and kind of bring that together. And I think sharing best practices is really what gives me hope.
Yeah, living within our confines, both having the energy that we only need and our planet. So we're talking about technology and innovation, but as you point out, just going back to the geological basics and saying, how do we live in a way that is truly in harmony, and we don't need to reinvent a wheel. We were given a fantastic wheel that we have done a good job breaking. How do we just go back and root into what the planet does best? Okay, I would like to give the audience an opportunity to ask some questions. If you would like, it looks like we have 2 mics flanking the seats, but it looks like they also might move around. So maybe just raise a hand, and maybe you'll collect a couple of questions to begin and then take some more as they come. So I see one gentleman here with his hand raised, and then a couple in the back there as well. So maybe I'll take questions from 2 people first, and then we'll go from there.
In your book, you explained energy return on investment, and based on those numbers, this synthetic oil, or whatever you want to call it, coming from Fort McMurray is about the worst idea you can imagine, because burning this kind of oil emits about 5 or 6 times as much carbon dioxide as oil from Texas or Saudi Arabia. Nonetheless, the Canadian government still subsidizes this industry with, I think you wrote $1,300 per person living in Canada, children, women, and men. Has your book made any impression on the Canadian government?
So energy return on investment, for those who may not be familiar, I certainly wasn't, is how much energy you put in versus how much energy you get out. So for normal oil drilling, like in Saudi Arabia or even the Gulf of Mexico, it's 25 or 30 to 1. So you get 30 times the energy out that you put in. That's a pretty good deal. It's 3-to-1 or 6-to-1 up in the tar sands. And just no business person would do that. So there has to be a whole bunch of things happening for free, or special arrangements being made. And then you add the CO2, that's another cost that is now being calculated at enormous resistance from Alberta, of course. I just lost your question now, sorry. The question was? Oh yeah, so it's definitely being read. Here's an interesting thing about Alberta. There's a lot of anti-government kind of right-wing hostility coming out of that province, and my book is #1 bestseller in the country and won a lot of awards and gotten a lot of press. I've been interviewed a lot, and what's interesting, Alberta is a place where you would expect me to be absolutely hammered. And I'm on Twitter a lot, and I don't get trolled by people in Alberta, and nothing has come out sort of through the press or kind of over the transom in my Canadian life where expressing anger or hostility at what I've done. And no one's sending me love letters from Alberta either, but I think they know it's true. They know it's true, and politicians know it's true, but the petroleum industry and the petroleum lobby is so powerful. And Canada right now is taking, like so many places, lurching to the right. It looks like BC, a fairly liberal place, is about to get a very conservative government and led by a climate denier. Alberta is led by a climate denier. The guy who may replace Justin Trudeau is a climate denier. These are really cynical people. And so I think among the citizenry, it's making an impact, but I think we cannot underestimate the grip that the petroleum industry has on our society, and because it built our society. And so that's where, we have to recognize the gorilla in the room. We have to honor the gorilla in the room, but it doesn't give the gorilla in the room a right to lie and abuse us and endanger us. And so that's what we have to kind of come to grips with now. And the petroleum industry and their supporters in government are not acting in good faith at the moment. And that's not just a Canadian problem, of course. But that is an issue. And we see people chipping away at it. We see progress being made. A quarter of Americans live in states that are now have lawsuits against oil companies for the lies they've told. So, we're kind of where we were with the cigarette industry maybe in the 70s or 80s. They're entrenched culturally, they're very well funded, and they can beat back a lot of lawyers, but eventually one of them is going to catch. And there was a significant one, a victory against Shell in The Hague in 2021. That was a pretty epic win. Of course, it's being appealed, but it's showing vulnerability, and more and more people are seeing, doing the math, as it were.
Yeah, in Germany, we had children bring forth a lawsuit and won at the federal level. So this is happening. This is hopeful. Yeah, Loyal, did you have anything to comment?
Yeah, I wanted to. It's interesting, and I appreciate the discussion on the ROI, the return on energy investment. The Canadian, especially the oil sands, is so particularly problematic. And the problem with politicization and this political idealization, where you actively climate denial, I think it's something that's very problematic, especially in North America. Because if you go to a country like the UK, for example, this is a country that has a very robust, had a very robust coal industry, still has a very robust gas industry, but has some of the most deployed offshore wind in the world, and has an extremely robust policy on renewables. Don't get me wrong, they've definitely done some issues, for sure. They definitely have some challenges with their oil and gas, but here, at least, the discussion on renewables is framed as an opportunity because it's so economically logical to pursue it in certain instances. Yes, I mean, there's still drilling for sure, which is fair, and from a climate perspective, you shouldn't be drilling at all, but if you compare the two, where one is actively denying this technology and then banning it outright, it's nonsensical, because even the lowest hanging fruit of where solar is maximally economically competitive, maximally viable, and where wind is maximally viable, this is where Texas is such an interesting example, because it has some of the best wind onshore in the world and some of the best solar conditions. So, I mean, and this is a great example where you say, even though the oil and gas there is being produced rampantly, for sure, but the renewables are penetrating massively as well. And I think that this is where, at the lowest hanging fruit, you've got to at least deploy renewables where they make most economic sense. I mean, this is like so common sense.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I want to get to some more questions. I saw some hands in the back earlier.
Well, thanks very much. I haven't read your book yet, hoping very much to win it later on in the raffle. I also work on climate policy, so I'm really interested, naturally, in the topic of cognitive dissonance. You were talking about how the Linders, I think they were called, kind of redefined what they thought was a safe space in the spur of the moment. Have you talked to them since? You know, where do they stand? Has their lifestyle changed? How has their perspective changed?
That is, thanks for asking that question, and thanks for your work also. So this book took so long, it took me 7 years to write it, and I did a lot of the interviews at 2016, 2017, and so and we've gotten into all this fake news stuff in the US now, and you know, Trump had gotten elected, and so I wasn't sure how these people would respond to me anymore. So I called them all up again. Everyone I interviewed, I called them up again and said, you know, remember me? We talked 5 years ago. They all remembered me. Turns out very positively, and they all gave me updates on their lives. You know, we had really good conversations. I was again, people were really good to me up there. Like, it's a very conservative place. I think there are a lot of climate deniers up there, but I think they are deniers out of necessity. That a lot of why, if you work in an oil town and you start harping on climate change, you are potentially compromising your position in the group. And some of those jobs are quite dangerous. And it's the same way cops and firefighters don't, you know, there's omerta, you know, you watch each other's back, and the loyalty is to the team, and that's part of what keeps you alive. And I think it's also what keeps us alive socially. And when you've got an isolated community like that, you don't want to go against it, even though I think maybe they know. So in any case, I think a bunch of the people that I interviewed still voted for the climate denying premier, because she's oil friendly and that's the business they're in. But a bunch of them don't live in Fort McMurray anymore. And neither Chandra nor her husband works for Suncor anymore. And, you know, and again, I'm not here to rag on individual companies, but I think things happened for them in that company that made them feel like they didn't want to work there anymore. And partly because the other reason people are leaving is because it's absolutely traumatizing to go through a fire like that. And so what we haven't talked about is PTSD, where now you have tens of thousands of Canadians who have PTSD who didn't used to have PTSD. And so there are scenes at the end of the book that are absolutely heartbreaking of, you know, months and years afterward, far away from the fire, things happen, and, you know, this to people's kids and this and that. And to me, there's an analogy with gun violence in the United States, that, you know, you left the school, you're in another school, but you can never go into a school again feeling the way you should be able to feel. You know, we should be able to feel safe in our towns. And now, when these folks smell smoke, or they see dense traffic, or they hear a helicopter, you know, they have to control their heart rate. You know, not everybody, but a lot of people. And so that's a real tragedy. And Fort McMurray, for itself, rebuilt itself bigger, because they got great insurance payouts. And as I said, the industry up there has laid off people and made it more efficient, but they've increased production. So they've now broken the 4 million barrel a day mark of this dog of a petroleum being pumped out of Fort McMurray into refineries in the northern United States, some of which are owned by Koch Industries. And those guys don't, you know, we know where they stand. And now in English Bay, which is the waterway in Vancouver, there used to be maybe 3 or 4 bitumen tankers a month, and now it's about 20. And because they increased the pipeline. And Trudeau bought a $35 billion pipeline for Alberta to pump bitumen out to the coast, and Albertans still hate him. And even though, Rich Kruger's a happy man. He feels very good about things, and he's said as much to the press. And, it's great for him, but not so great for many others. And so and the last thing I'll say is that I think a lot of us hoped that as people, the one upside to these climate disasters is we would get more people who were dialed into the urgency of climate action. I don't think that's what happens. I think what people want is the same thing they want after a school shooting, is they want their arm to work again, they want their kid to not wake up screaming at night, they want their old life back. That's what they want. So if anything, it may actually remove them from the movement, because they're so busy just trying, like Chandra did, to create some normal space for themselves where they can feel like they used to feel. And you can't blame anybody for that. That is being a human being and having responsibility for people you love and trying to create some kind of order in a chaotic situation.
All right, we have time for one more question. I think I see someone back there.
Yes, hello, thank you. My name is Susanne. I work for Tagesspiegel as a climate reporter, Susanne Ehlerding. And you halfly answered my question already, like, does the government at least change its path or have more ambitious climate politics now? But it seems like it doesn't.
I think some, obviously, the U.S. under Biden is much more ambitious. I think Trudeau, if he didn't have the opposition that he has, would be more ambitious. We have had a carbon tax for a long time. British Columbia was a leader in that, a pioneer. That's probably going to get canceled now. So we really appear to be taking a step backward. And the degrading, corrosive influence of populist politics is hard to combat, because it sets a very low bar, and it's just easier to break things than it is to build them. And but I could not have written this book if I wasn't hopeful. And what we're asking the world to do, what we're asking our civilization to do, is something it's never had to do before. And what we're learning is how much a part of our lives the petroleum industry is. And we need to reckon that. We need to do that tally. And then we're also asking it to make this massive transition globally, 8 billion people in a ridiculously short period of time, partly because of predatory delay. But so we're doing this extraordinarily difficult thing, and it won't happen fast enough for most of the people in this room, but it is happening. And especially when you look at younger generations, and a happy story, I sat next to this incredibly aggressive financial person. She was in a business program at ASU in Arizona. She was, I think, from Pakistan or something, and she was majoring in business, had already at 21 gotten a job for BlackRock, that huge investment company, and she was in it for the money. She was she was a brilliant person, a fascinating person to sit next to on the plane. And this woman she's a name we're probably going to know in 10 years, and very, very impressive young person. And I said, so what are you interested in? And she said, well, when we started the school, they gave us a list of different areas we might go into, and one of them was petroleum industry or maybe mortgages or different types of finance. And for her last choice was petroleum. And I said, why? Because of, for environmental reasons. She said, oh no, it's a dying industry. That's just not where the money is. And this is a young lady I would absolutely listen to, because she was all about the money. And she is paying very close attention to where things are going right now. And likewise, I talked to this French guy who went to this very rarefied French law school, and he went back to talk to younger students. And it used to be that Total Energy, the national oil company, would go through and just cherry pick lawyers from the best French law schools. And he said now they're picking from the bottom third of the classes. Because he said, and this is, this friend of mine, the lawyer, the French lawyer, said, in English, he said, they don't want the stain.
Oof.
And again, this was a guy who's, these are anecdotes. This is not data, these are anecdotes, but I think they're interesting.
Absolutely.
And to me, they're very hopeful.
Yeah, if the bottom line points you in a climate in a green direction, feels extremely hopeful for our capitalist society. Okay, we unfortunately have to wrap up. John Loyal, thank you so much for joining me on stage. This is a fascinating discussion. Congratulations on your book. It is a Herculean piece that you have put together. It's incredible. Yeah, and I will hand over to Aaron.
Thank you.